May 1943. London was entering its fourth spring under the shadow of war. The city had grown accustomed to blackout curtains, ration books, and the shrill warnings of air raid sirens. Beneath the surface bustle of recovery and reconstruction after the Blitz, a quieter war pressed on, one measured not by bomb craters or headlines, but by the flow of paper, whispers, and intercepted signals. It was a war of clerks, couriers, censors, and messages, fought in mailrooms, basements, and listening posts far from the front lines. Inside a nondescript building on the northern edge of Regent's Park, the British Postal Censorship Office operated with quiet intensity. It was one of several hubs where mail, domestic and international, was examined, redacted, copied, or delayed depending on what was found. The sheer volume of correspondence during wartime was staggering. Soldiers sent letters from remote postings, diplomats mailed reports, merchant sailors passed on news from foreign docks. Much of it was mundane, but among the flow every so often a pattern emerged, something too practiced, too coded, too careful. To manage this avalanche of paper, the Ministry of Information employed thousands. Among them were censors, translators, typists, and file clerks. Some had been schoolteachers, others museum staff or civil servants. Most were doing their part in an unfamiliar war. And then there were the mailroom assistants, junior staff whose job it was to sort, redirect, and deliver the endless cascade of letters that passed through the building each day. One of them was Thomas Shaw. Shaw was 26 years old, with prematurely thinning hair and an unobtrusive manner that suited his role. He had been a library assistant before the war, employed at the British Museum. When his conscription number came up in early 1941, a childhood heart condition had spared him from frontline duty. Instead, he was assigned to wartime civil service and soon found himself working under the Directorate of Postal Censorship. He arrived early each morning, always a few minutes before his shift began. His routine was consistent. He walked the same route from his shared lodging near Camden, carried the same scuffed leather satchel, and took tea from the same chipped mug in the staff canteen. He was neither particularly ambitious nor particularly social, but he was methodical, observant, and, above all, patient. It was these qualities, rather than any formal training, that would eventually place him at the centre of something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. The censorship office was divided into multiple sections, each focusing on specific regions or languages. The European section in particular had grown rapidly after the fall of France and the entry of Italy into the war. Letters sent to or from occupied territories were scrutinised closely. Neutral countries, especially Portugal, Spain, Sweden and Switzerland, posed an even greater challenge. Though officially non-belligerent, their ports, banks and consulates were often used by agents and intermediaries from both Axis and Allied nations. This ambiguity made every envelope from Lisbon, Geneva or Madrid a potential source of intelligence, or risk. Mailroom assistants like Shaw were not expected to read the contents of letters. Their role was to sort by origin, destination, language, and censorship priority. Red-flagged letters, those involving suspect addresses, patterns, or frequent foreign exchanges, were routed to senior censors and analysts. Most days, Shaw handled hundreds of envelopes, cross-referencing postal codes, deciphering hurried handwriting, and ensuring the correct routing slips were attached. But Shaw had developed a habit, formed not from instruction but from his librarian's instincts. He noticed patterns, a recurring address, a handwriting style that didn't match the supposed sender, stamps that looked artificially aged. These details weren't necessarily actionable, but they stood out to him. He began keeping a private log, small entries scribbled in shorthand on the inside cover of a personal notebook, hidden inside a drawer by his sorting station. His entries were mostly benign. Lisbon, Paddington, same block script 4 times in June. Or, Hotel Genève address used again, different name. He didn't share these notes with anyone. He wasn't even sure why he kept them. But over time, his quiet records began to form a map, not of geography, but of recurrence. It was not a system he could explain easily, but it gave him a sense of something just beneath the surface. Then, in late May, something shifted. Among a stack of inbound foreign correspondence, a letter arrived from Lisbon addressed to an elderly woman in Sussex. The envelope was otherwise unremarkable. Pale blue, standard Portuguese stamp, a return address that matched an existing registry of legitimate senders. Shaw almost passed it through without pause until he noticed the handwriting. The script was familiar, not because of any content, he wasn't permitted to read that, but because of the way the G's curled at the tail and how the capital S had a distinctive, unnecessary flourish. He flipped back through his mental index. 3 weeks earlier, a similar envelope had passed through his hands, same postmark, same station of origin, but addressed to a different recipient in Essex. He retrieved the older routing slip from the archives, a slow, bureaucratic process. When he finally held both envelopes side by side, his suspicion deepened. The return addresses differed slightly, but the handwriting matched perfectly. Both senders claimed to be men in their 60s writing to family, but the letters had gone through the same censor, received near-identical processing notes, and raised no official flags. Shaw reported the anomaly to his section supervisor, a man named Dempsey, who had served in Army intelligence during the last war. Dempsey reviewed the materials with mild interest, but caution against overinterpretation. "Portuguese post is erratic," he said, "and Lisbon's full of people using borrowed identities, refugees, expats, merchants. It's not unusual." Shaw nodded, accepted the dismissal and returned to his station. But something lingered. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Again from Lisbon, again with handwriting that matched the previous two. This time, the recipient was in Bristol. It passed through the same censorship sub-branch. Shaw logged it quietly and said nothing, but then came a letter from Geneva. The envelope was nearly identical in size and style to the Lisbon correspondence. And again, the script was the same. The sender's name differed, this time a Madame H rather than a Senior A, but the flourishes were unmistakable. Shaw pulled his notebook and began charting dates and locations. Over the next week, 4 more similar letters passed through, all addressed to different recipients across southern England, all allegedly sent by different individuals in neutral European cities, but all bearing the same distinctive handwriting. The destinations were varied enough to avoid suspicion in isolation, but seen together, they formed a trail. By early June, Shaw had documented over a dozen such letters. Still, he hesitated to raise the matter again. The censorship office was overstretched, and his previous report had earned only polite disinterest. He was, after all, a junior assistant without access to the letter's content or clearance to make assessments. It was not his place to interpret. But the pattern now seemed undeniable. It was not until the 17th of June, following the arrival of a letter from Stockholm, bearing the same script and addressed to a private clinic in Kent, that Shaw made a decision. Instead of routing the envelope through standard channels, he marked it for delayed processing, allowing him time to quietly request a secondary review by a more senior official known for taking unusual cases, Miss Eleanor Brandt, a linguistic specialist with a reputation for attention to detail. Brandt received the envelope later that afternoon. Her involvement would set in motion a quiet inquiry, one that, over the weeks to follow, would gradually uncover a network of communications far more coordinated than anyone had initially suspected. For now, however, the matter remained a footnote in a ledger, an anomaly in an overburdened system, noticed only by a mailroom assistant with a librarian's eye and an instinct for things out of place. Eleanor Brandt had never worked in intelligence before the war. A polyglot raised between Vienna and London, she had lectured in comparative linguistics at the University of Leeds until 1939. When war broke out, she was recruited first by the Ministry of Information and later reassigned to postal censorship, due to her fluency in German, French, and several Nordic dialects. Her role was technical, translating, decoding idiomatic phrasing, and identifying anomalies in phrasing patterns across languages. She was not part of MI5, nor did she have access to ultra-decrypts or high-level operational intelligence, but her evaluations were taken seriously by those who did. When the Lisbon-Stockholm letter crossed her desk on June 17, 1943, she had no reason to treat it as anything more than a routine assignment. It had already been flagged, unofficially, as she would later learn, by a mailroom clerk she had never met. But when she examined the handwriting and return address, her instincts stirred. The letter was written in what appeared to be French, though its vocabulary was oddly formal. Certain turns of phrase seemed unnecessarily complex for the letter's stated purpose. A note from a presumed aunt to a niece recovering from illness. Sentences meandered, and idioms were clumsily inserted, as if the writer were deliberately obscuring meaning beneath a surface of politeness. Brandt didn't alert anyone immediately. Instead, she requested the other envelopes previously identified by Thomas Shaw. When told they had already been processed and archived, she filed a formal requisition to retrieve them from the retained mail cache, a bureaucratic manoeuvre that took 4 days and the cooperation of a sceptical deputy archivist. By June 22nd, she had 5 letters laid out before her, each from different European cities: Lisbon, Madrid, Geneva, Stockholm and Dublin. Each bore a distinct sender name and address, but the similarities were striking. The salutation style, the closing phrases and the handwriting all converged around a single hand, disguised in slight variations but unmistakably similar under careful comparison. Crucially, Brandt began to detect linguistic patterns. Phrases that appeared benign in French translated awkwardly into German syntax. In the Lisbon letter, for instance, she found a reference to le grand-oncle qui apporte le thé du nord, the great-uncle who brings tea from the north. On the surface, it seemed irrelevant, but in context, the wording was odd. Why mention a great-uncle bringing tea during wartime shortages, and why specify from the north? She began compiling notes. Some of the language she suspected might be constructed code, messages embedded in plausible sentences using a shared lexicon, agreed upon by sender and recipient. This technique, known to Allied censors as letter padding, was increasingly used by Axis agents, especially those operating through neutral countries. What concerned her most, however, was the spread of the addresses. Unlike standard family correspondence, these letters were reaching an unusually wide net of recipients: a boarding house in Bristol, a chemist's shop in Essex, a private clinic in Kent, and a retired naval officer in Sussex. The recipients were not known intelligence targets, and none were on the Home Office's watch lists. On the surface, they appeared unrelated, but as Brandt dug further, she noticed another pattern. The names matched recently deceased individuals. In some cases, death notices had appeared in local newspapers only weeks earlier. It was possible, likely even, that the mail was intended to be collected by third parties using these names as covers, exploiting the gap between death and official records updates. She compiled a preliminary report and sent it to Dempsey, the section supervisor who had earlier brushed off Thomas Shaw's concerns. This time, Dempsey took notice. The report landed on his desk at a particularly sensitive moment. In recent weeks, British naval convoys in the North Atlantic had suffered losses that intelligence analysts couldn't entirely explain. U-boat sightings were frequent, but the level of interception and coordination by German naval forces had suggested advanced foreknowledge of Allied routes, something beyond what radio intercepts alone could provide. Though no one had drawn a direct connection, the possibility that operational information was leaking from the British Isles through innocuous-seeming letters became harder to ignore. Dempsey forwarded the report to Section 5 of MI5, responsible for counter-espionage. It was received with cautious interest. The wartime censorship apparatus was often seen as a blunt tool, useful for general security but ill-suited to high-level spycraft. Yet the level of detail in Brandt's linguistic analysis, combined with the geographic spread of the addresses and the mounting irregularities, made it worth a closer look. MI5 assigned a junior field officer, Alan Hargreaves, to conduct quiet inquiries into the recipients. His task was not to make arrests or confront suspects, but to observe. Within a week, his surveillance notes began to accumulate. Unidentified individuals arriving at rural post offices on specific days, collecting mail under aliases, postboxes being cleared suspiciously quickly, and in one case, a man seen retrieving a letter from the porch of a closed shop, then immediately discarding the envelope into a storm drain before boarding a tram. The pattern of coordination suggested a courier network, likely run by a neutral embassy or disguised through commercial channels. But the letters themselves were now under deeper scrutiny. MI5 arranged for controlled delivery of 2 intercepted letters, allowing them to track the handlers from pickup to the point of handoff. The trail led not to high-ranking diplomats or enemy nationals, but to a series of seemingly unrelated locals: a nurse, a fruit vendor, a railway ticket inspector. It became evident that what they were observing was a low-profile network of cutouts, intermediaries who may not have fully understood the nature of their role. The letters, it seemed, were being used to pass coded information between agents operating inside Britain and contacts abroad. Meanwhile, Eleanor Brandt and Thomas Shaw had never met. Their names appeared in different branches of the internal reporting chain. Shaw, for his part, continued his routine work in the mailroom, unaware of the growing significance his initial observations had taken on. He had returned to anonymity, back to sorting and stamping, his logbook tucked into its usual drawer. But within the walls of the Directorate and MI5, a slow pivot was underway. New guidelines were issued to censorship officers regarding neutral country correspondence. Additional staff were trained in handwriting analysis, surveillance units were expanded, and a temporary task group was formed, jointly overseen by the Home Office and the Foreign Office, to investigate potential breaches through diplomatic mail immunity. Even with these efforts, the scope of the network remained unclear. There were no dramatic raids, no mass arrests. The priority was containment, identifying nodes, mapping patterns, and preventing further leaks without tipping off those involved. The war, after all, was still ongoing, and the enemy was quick to adapt. By early July, at least 2 confirmed couriers had disappeared, likely exfiltrated through neutral shipping lines or reassigned within the network. But several others were quietly detained, interrogated, and in some cases turned into double agents. Back in Regent's Park, Shaw noticed that fewer Lisbon letters were crossing his desk. The patterns he had logged were fading. Whether the network had been shut down or merely shifted its methods, he couldn't say. His notes continued, though less frequently, and his demeanour remained unchanged, unassuming, quiet, methodical. No one in his department formally acknowledged his role. The war did not make room for ceremony over such things, but his logbook, now copied and preserved by censors under Brandt's direction, had been included in the internal report sent to Whitehall. It was titled simply, Irregular Postal Indicators, Case Review, June-July 1943. By mid-July 1943, the intelligence community's view of wartime communication through neutral channels had changed. What had once been treated as a logistical challenge, one of volume, language and routing, was now recognised as a potential strategic vulnerability. Yet the growing concern over letter-based espionage did not lead to mass purges or the closure of foreign mail systems. The war effort demanded discretion. British counterintelligence understood that reacting too strongly could tip their hand, leading the enemy to adapt before the full extent of the network was mapped. Inside the Postal Censorship Office, Eleanor Brandt had been quietly elevated. She was now coordinating a small sub-team tasked with deeper analysis of cross-border correspondence involving suspect patterns. The team's remit remained limited. Brandt was not granted full operational authority, but her reports were now being reviewed directly by senior staff in Section 4. Thomas Shaw remained unaware of most of this. His work continued as before, quiet, repetitive, and often unnoticed, but a subtle change had taken place. Since his informal report had helped trigger the investigation, some of his routing decisions were now quietly monitored by an internal liaison from MI5. Shaw had not been told this, but his mail stream, the flow of letters he sorted daily, was now considered a point of interest. What neither Shaw nor Brandt yet knew was that the network they had helped to expose was not an isolated system. It was part of a broader German strategy coordinated by the Abwehr, the military intelligence service of the Wehrmacht. Over the course of 1942 and early 1943, the Abwehr had developed overlapping courier lines through Spain, Portugal, Sweden and Ireland. These networks, while often informal and ad hoc, relied on plausible cover, business letters, family correspondence, travel updates, and medical inquiries. Embedded within these messages were fragments of information, often passed using prearranged codes. In isolation, a single letter meant little. A phrase about weather or a reference to a distant uncle might seem innocuous. But when matched against other messages, and when processed by trained analysts, the full picture could emerge. This was the challenge that now preoccupied Brandt's team. In late July, a breakthrough came not from any single letter but from an aggregation of dozens. Brandt and a colleague, a former museum archivist named Clifford Webb, began reconstructing sequences based on mailing dates and sender aliases. One particular cluster, messages originating in Madrid and Lisbon and addressed to various coastal towns in the southwest of England, showed a pattern of phrases referencing shorelines, winds from the east, and fishing conditions. At first glance, the references seemed harmless, even poetic, but when cross-referenced against convoy schedules and merchant ship departure logs from Plymouth and Falmouth, a disturbing correlation appeared. Messages referencing clear winds often preceded U-boat attacks by 48 to 72 hours. Mentions of low tide or stormy nets often matched with delayed or cancelled sailings. Still, this was circumstantial. Brandt, cautious by nature, refused to label it definitive without stronger evidence. That evidence came not from her desk, but from a field agent operating under diplomatic cover in Lisbon. MI6 had grown concerned about increased courier traffic among certain commercial agents in the city, individuals not formally linked to embassies, but who frequently used consular services and neutral banks. In a quiet handoff arranged through the British legation, MI6 intercepted a parcel destined for England. Inside was a bundle of seemingly unrelated items, outdated tourist brochures, Portuguese cigarette packets, and, folded within a paperback novel, 3 letters addressed to individuals in Cornwall and Devon. The letters were passed directly to Brandt's team for forensic analysis. Each bore stamps and markings consistent with Portuguese origin. But more telling was the handwriting. It was the same stylized script Shaw had first flagged 2 months earlier. The letters referenced weather, market stalls, and family health, but embedded within them were peculiar phrasings. The market is thin this week, but the fish are numerous, and sales have returned early. No doubt the wind is turning. To most readers, it was nonsense. But Brandt recognised the structure. The verbs and nouns followed a non-standard pairing sequence, something she had noted in earlier messages. It was a kind of semantic mask, where real meaning was embedded in word substitution. She reconstructed a likely key. Certain words equated to specific convoy types, others to timing or routes. Fish meant merchant vessels. Wind meant naval escort. Market thin meant limited protection. Taken together, the letters forecasted a convoy departure from Falmouth with minimal escort, details that had not been made public and which were known only within Admiralty circles. The realization changed everything. The implication was clear. The German network had access to sensitive British naval planning. The leak could not be from abroad. It had to originate within the United Kingdom. Someone with proximity to convoy routing was either compromised or unknowingly providing information that was being passed along through intermediaries. Section 5 responded swiftly. A compartmentalised investigation was launched into naval logistics units across southern England. Shore patrol offices, port authorities, and even civil telegraph services were scrutinised. But the flow of letters continued, slower now and more cautiously phrased. One particular letter, received in early August and addressed to an obscure cottage hospital in Dorset, prompted immediate concern. The phrasing, "the sea is quiet, but the gulls have grown loud," was flagged by Brandt as a possible alert. She feared it might indicate an anticipated troop movement or training operation. The letter was intercepted before delivery, but its mere presence suggested that the network remained partially active, adapting, shifting, but not yet dismantled. For Thomas Shaw, these developments remained largely invisible. He had not been read into the investigation and was not privy to the deeper implications, but in late August he was summoned, quietly and without ceremony, to an internal meeting. Waiting for him was a senior official from MI5, accompanied by Eleanor Brandt. It was their first meeting. The official introduced himself only as Mr. Langley. He did not reveal the full scope of the investigation, nor did he ask Shaw to explain his methods. Instead, he offered a brief acknowledgement. "Your observations," Langley said, "were more valuable than you know." Brandt nodded but said little. She was already thinking ahead, to the next letters, the next patterns, and the question that still hung in the air. How far had the leak gone? Shaw, still unsure of why he'd been called in, simply listened. When the meeting ended, he returned to his desk. His work resumed. But from that day forward, his logbook was no longer just a personal habit. It became part of the official record. A quiet act of diligence, once overlooked, had opened a window into a hidden war playing out in pen strokes and paper folds, one that now demanded the full attention of the state. The task of unravelling the full extent of the espionage network embedded within Britain's civilian mail system was far from straightforward. Despite the breakthroughs achieved by Brandt's team and the quietly expanding MI5 operation, the network itself had proven resilient, compartmentalised, and shrouded beneath layers of social ordinariness. The couriers were not men in trench coats or foreign agents with false passports. They were nurses, postal clerks, pensioners, and even, on 2 occasions, teenage boys. Most knew little of the messages they carried or the role they played. It was this banality that had shielded the network for so long. By September 1943, the internal inquiry had grown into a dedicated interagency committee. The Admiralty had quietly assigned a liaison to monitor naval leak vulnerabilities. MI6, though primarily foreign-focused, offered support through its stations in Lisbon and Geneva. The Foreign Office, ever cautious about diplomatic friction with neutral countries, sought to limit exposure. It was agreed early on. The discovery of the network would not result in public prosecutions. Arrests, if any, would be limited to domestic participants, and even those would be managed under the defence regulations without public trial. Within the Postal Censorship Office, Eleanor Brandt's temporary subunit was granted formal status as a special analysis section. Her team expanded to 6, including 2 linguists, a cipher specialist seconded from Bletchley Park, and an archivist familiar with European postal systems. Their work was exhaustive and at times grinding. Dozens of letters a day were now being diverted to their desk, some based on Shaw's sorting patterns, others through new algorithms developed to flag linguistic anomalies. It was at this point that institutional pushback began to surface. The primary tension was not ideological but operational. Senior administrators at the Ministry of Information, already burdened by staff shortages and rising public pressure, resented the additional scrutiny imposed on an already overstretched system. Several mid-level managers in the censorship office raised concerns that overreach was affecting morale. Some bristled at the notion that their departments might have missed warning signs. One senior censor, unaware of the full operation, went so far as to suggest that Brandt's team was engaging in academic indulgence under the guise of security. Brandt, whose temperament was more reserved than confrontational, responded through documentation. She compiled a formal memorandum supported by examples, timelines, and statistical overlays. It traced the evolution of the network's activity, highlighted correlations with Allied shipping losses, and included detailed linguistic deconstructions of 10 intercepted letters. The report, submitted to the head of the Censorship Directorate in October, was coolly received. Its conclusions were not challenged, but its implications were inconvenient. Meanwhile, Shaw had been quietly seconded, not promoted, not officially reassigned, simply seconded, to work adjacent to Brandt's team. His title remained unchanged. His desk remained in the same corner of the mailroom, but every few days he would be handed a supplemental sorting list, directing him to review inbound letters from specific cities, addresses, or sender aliases. Occasionally he was given authority to delay suspicious mail for further screening, a responsibility typically reserved for trained censors. This informal role placed Shaw in an increasingly ambiguous position. He was not a trained intelligence officer. He had no security clearance beyond what was minimally required. Yet his pattern recognition skills had now been integrated into a national counter-espionage effort. Brandt respected his instincts, but worried about the lack of formal oversight. At one point in late October, she quietly requested that he be enrolled in a short-term security analysis course offered by MI5. The request was declined. "Too junior," the reply read. "Best kept in his lane." That same week, one of Shaw's delayed letters, an otherwise unremarkable envelope from Malmö addressed to a rural dentist's office in Wiltshire, revealed a new coding structure. This time the message had shifted to a German-English hybrid, with Scandinavian orthographic markers. The sender used poetic metaphors about teeth, decay, and hidden roots, which on deeper analysis appeared to reference inland fuel depots and road convoys. The adaptability of the network's messaging system was becoming apparent. As patterns were identified and disrupted, new ones emerged, testing the limits of the censorship system's capacity to keep up. The sense of strain grew. Among intelligence officials, there was now recognition that a passive strategy, intercepting and decoding after the fact, would not be sufficient. A preemptive disruption was needed, yet the political risk was considerable. Many of the suspected letters were still travelling via diplomatic pouches, neutral embassies, or commercial couriers from countries with which Britain maintained delicate wartime relations. Acting too publicly could jeopardise broader diplomatic objectives. The decision, when it came, was shaped by a partial failure. In early November, a convoy sailing under blackout conditions from Liverpool to Halifax suffered a coordinated U-boat assault. 6 ships were lost. Initial investigation suggested a radio leak, but Brandt's team identified a letter sent from Dublin a week earlier and intercepted too late that described a quiet herd moving undercover towards the dark western pasture. Though circumstantial, the timeline was damning. Brandt and her team submitted their assessment within 48 hours. This time, the response was immediate. MI5 authorised a limited series of field actions designed not to arrest, but to sever. Known couriers, especially those using drop points or falsified addresses, were intercepted quietly. Surveillance was escalated. Communications with foreign embassies were rerouted or delayed under plausible pretexts. Most notably, the Foreign Office lodged formal, if veiled, diplomatic objections, with several neutral legations suspected of facilitating covert mail drops. The effect was immediate. Over the course of 3 weeks, suspect correspondence declined by nearly 80%. Several sender aliases disappeared entirely. The poetic metaphors vanished, replaced by more cautious, stilted prose. In internal memos, the change was described as a degradation of hostile mail structure. But no one believed the matter was concluded. For sure, these developments were felt more subtly. He noticed the reduction in familiar handwriting, the absence of certain telltale markings. His logbook grew thinner. Yet a new sense of uncertainty crept in. Had the network gone dormant? Or had it simply adapted beyond their reach? In December, a small gathering was held in a side room of the censorship office. Present were Eleanor Brandt, Clifford Webb, 2 officers from MI5, and, at her insistence, Thomas Shaw. No formal citations were given, no medals issued, but Brandt took a moment to acknowledge Shaw directly. "You saw what we didn't," she said. "Not because you were told to, but because you were paying attention." Shaw didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the notebook in his hands. Worn now, the pages curled at the corners. He hadn't added much in recent weeks. After the meeting, he returned to his station, quietly resumed his sorting, and resumed the rhythm that had defined his wartime life. But the war, and the system around him, had changed. By early 1944, the British postal censorship system had undergone quiet, systemic reform. The war was entering a new phase. Allied forces had secured North Africa, Italy had surrendered, and preparations for a cross-channel invasion were well underway. Yet on the home front, vigilance remained paramount. With enemy networks disrupted but not dismantled, the flow of mail through neutral countries remained a critical point of scrutiny. The espionage ring that had operated through coded letters and disguised correspondence was never fully exposed in public. There were no headlines, no mass trials, and no official recognition of the operation's unravelling. It remained, as so much of wartime counterintelligence did, a story confined to internal reports and closed archives. Eleanor Brandt continued her work in the Postal Censorship Office until late 1944. Her team, once a temporary unit responding to a single irregularity, had become a permanent fixture. The analytical methods developed under her direction, particularly her classification of semantic displacement and structural idiom codes, were later adapted by cryptanalytic departments and incorporated into broader counter-subversion efforts. Brandt herself declined a post-war offer to join the Foreign Office. She returned to academia, lecturing briefly in post-war London before settling into a quieter role as an editor of linguistic reference works. Clifford Webb, her analytical partner, joined a post-war declassification unit, helping to catalogue wartime intelligence documents for internal review. He would later publish a modest history of the censorship office, omitting names and details, but hinting at the depth of work carried out by those behind the scenes. Thomas Shaw was never formally acknowledged in official records. His name did not appear in any published accounts, nor was he promoted or awarded. After the war, he resumed clerical work at the British Museum, eventually retiring in the mid-1970s. He did not speak of his wartime service, nor did he preserve any official documents. His logbook, however, was retained, not by him, but by a senior archivist at the Directorate, who recognised its quiet significance. It remains to this day held in a closed collection at the National Archives, its pages annotated only with initials and dates. The spy network he helped expose was never given a name. Intelligence files referred to it simply as the Southern Mail Circuit, and later by a numerical designation. What is known is that its disruption forced the Abwehr to reroute its efforts, relying more heavily on encrypted radio and riskier courier systems. The loss of reliable, deniable communication through neutral mail significantly hampered its flexibility in the months leading up to D-Day. Among the few internal assessments written after the fact, one note, unsigned, possibly penned by an MI5 analyst, stands out. It reads, "The system failed not from a breakthrough in code breaking, nor from a capture in the field, but because one quiet man noticed the same handwriting too many times." Such was the nature of many wartime victories, unsung, quiet, buried under layers of operational necessity. For every coded message intercepted, every false identity uncovered, there were countless unnoticed contributions, small acts of diligence, patience, and observation that never reached beyond the walls in which they occurred. Thomas Shaw never asked to do more than his job. But by paying attention when no one else did, he helped crack open a hidden war, one letter at a time.